Dr. Dennis is an associate professor in special education in the School of Teacher Ed. Her research interests include interventions to enhance the language and literacy skills of preschool age children with or at risk for disabilities. Our other areas of interest include assessment, accountability, and behavior management. Dr. Dennis has published refereed articles in both the early childhood and early childhood special education fields, as well as presented at numerous conferences on topics related to literacy and language development of preschool age children with or at risk for disabilities. So just to give you again a sense of how the talk is going to be structured, Dr. Dennis is going to spend the first 30 minutes presenting her talk, and then we'll open it up for a Q&A. So Dr. Dennis, it's all yours.
Okay, well, thank you all. It's very nice to have so many folks joining for a portion of your Friday afternoon. I appreciate it. So as Dr. Ibork mentioned, I'm going to talk about practice-based coaching within the context of early childhood. I do kind of live in, my training came from the perspective of early childhood and special ed as sort of being one and the same. So I sort of view the field and how I approach our discipline in terms of early childhood from both of those lenses. So when I talk about early childhood, I'm kind of talking about it broadly in terms of both early childhood, typical, at risk, and also referring to children with disabilities. So I was also sharing with Drs. Ibork and Flory before we started that I have built in some comic relief a couple of times here in the presentation, which I hope is helpful. It's kind of how I'm surviving these days. That and having a 2-year-old who is very much into Halloween this year, but she doesn't quite have her W's when she says scary witch. And so it sounds like something else entirely. And we've gotten a number of side eyes out in public when she's been very excited and saw a scary witch, and it doesn't quite come across that way. So I'm constantly entertained by that as well. So to kind of get started, what led to this line of research? And so we'll get to Seinfeld here in just a minute. It is my first comic relief opportunity, but I did publish my dissertation back in 2010 on the topic of professional development, specifically coaching with performance feedback, which has a pretty established literature base in the field of early childhood. So I've provided that citation, or that reference rather, there for you. So I started there, and I feel like I've sort of come full circle in that I'm doing this work again. But I also wanted to say yada yada, because there's been quite a bit of time in between, obviously 2010, and then ultimately it took me, of course, several years to publish and where I am now. So just enjoy Seinfeld. I think we've tested the sound, but if you can't hear it, please do let me know. And I apologize for it being so small and technologically challenged somewhat still as well.
So, Marcy, you should have seen me in the hot tub today.
Why?
I was naked.
Oh, George.
I saw it.
How'd he look?
Okay, I wouldn't see it again.
You know, a friend of mine thought she got Legionnaire's disease in a hot tub.
Really? What happened?
Yada, yada, yada. Just some bad egg salad. I'll be right back.
Nice girl.
Lovely.
I noticed she's big on the phrase yada yada.
Is yada yada bad?
Oh, yada yada's good. She's very succinct.
She is succinct.
Yeah, it's like you're dating USA Today.
So, I'm on 3rd Avenue, minding my own business, and yada, yada, yada. I get a free massage and a facial.
Wow. What a succinct story.
I'm surprised you drive a Cadillac.
Oh, it's not mine. It's my mother's.
Oh. Are you close with your parents?
Well, they gave birth to me, and yada yada.
Yada what?
Yada yada yada.
Okay, so yada yada, there's a lot that's happened since I've talked or published in the realm of professional development. So here I am back again, this time looking at a little bit of a different framework that Pat Snyder and colleagues have published a great deal on. And I put here a reference to an article in Teaching Exceptional Children that I was able to publish with a few of the doctoral students in special education that I'm going to be referring to a number of the figures and things as we proceed through this presentation, but I did put that up there if you're interested in reading that publication. And I kind of put the cart before the horse a little bit, and then I published the practitioner version of this topic. I'm working on the research piece. That's what I'm talking about today. It is under review, so fingers crossed that something positive comes out of that effort as well. So to introduce the topic, in our field, early childhood special educators and speech language pathologists are often the primary service providers to provide or to address early language and literacy deficits in preschool children with developmental disabilities. They are the ones in the front line, so to speak, obviously the ones who are writing IEP goals and all of that. But we also know, and probably not just specific to early childhood, but in other fields as well, or in other disciplines within special ed, that paperwork and caseload and things just continue to grow monumentally for these folks. And so oftentimes we see that kids with disabilities that have these specific language and literacy goals may not be getting all of the services and supports that they could, because teachers and SLPs are overwhelmed with some of these other responsibilities that are going on. So it started to make me think, well, so what about paraprofessionals? And so we know that paraprofessionals in early childhood spend a significant amount of time interacting with children. I think they're, and this is just anecdotally me saying, that they are an untapped resource in terms of folks that have been in the field for quite a long time, often longer than the teachers themselves. So they have lots of practical experience and ideas and, you know, ways that we can utilize all of that knowledge to our benefit. And so for this reason, they're often undervalued in terms of their contributions to the classroom setting. They don't often have the same access to professional development opportunities as teachers. And so we know that PD in the form of training with direct feedback and ongoing follow-up has been proven to be successful in the literature. So that ongoing follow-up, meaning coaching. I think we all know that one-shot training workshops and all of that are not effective in actually making sustainable change in terms of practice and you know, teachers' ability to feel confident in what they're doing in terms of their instructional practices. So this coaching component, again, I was interested in it 10 years ago, but this more specific individualized sort of approach that is practice-based coaching, again, is well researched. I put a number of references here for you that have been published in the area of social emotional development, not as much in language and literacy. So I kind of found that was my in, so to speak, in terms of contributing to this literature base. But practice-based coaching as a framework is really meant to be individualized. It's meant to really take what the teacher feels like they need in terms of supports, and, you know, taking their input and sort of building that into the coaching framework. And so practice-based coaching has these 3 stages. So the first one is a needs assessment, which is just watching what types of supports are needed, what are some areas that need to be further developed based on sort of those initial observations. And then based on that, there is a goal that's developed. So an individualized goal related to specific strategies. In this case, I'm going to be talking about evidence-based strategies specific to language and literacy development within the context of shared book reading. So I'll get to that a little bit more. But so you set a goal and then you have an action plan. And within that action plan, the specific behaviors that teachers will implement are outlined that will ultimately lead to them hopefully meeting their goal, as well as the types of supports the coach can provide that align with those teacher behaviors. And so again, in this way, teachers and coach really have this collaborative relationship, reciprocal relationship, such that they feel like the coachee feels like that it's an individualized process, so they can really, their input is valued in that way. So then we move to stage 2, which is a focused observation. Obviously, on-site observation data is possible. When we're conducting our research, we're often doing this via video. So we record the sessions and then provide feedback using video clips, using anecdotal notes. In this particular study, we did coaching once a week. The coach reviews the teacher storybook reading sessions prior to the coaching session that they have with the teacher to, again, identify opportunities for showing the teacher, reflective feedback in the form of, here's some things that I saw that you did really well. Here are some missed opportunities or things we can continue to develop. And that's sort of how the conversation within the coaching session goes. And then that kind of leads to stage 3, which is talking about what was effective, what barriers were in place. And this can be related to the strategies themselves, but we all as educators know that there's other barriers that sometimes come into play. We've had to talk to teachers about, maybe being on the playground where the child is super distracted when you're conducting this intervention is not the greatest place to be. And that's why it was very difficult for you to deliver this particular intervention and just those sorts of things. And so it's whatever barriers exist for that educator so that they are able to continue to refine implementation and ultimately meet that goal and feel successful in what they're doing. If the goal's not met, then they talk about potential reasons why. Maybe they create a new goal or modify the current goal, and then outline some action steps that both the teacher and the coach will take to address those identified barriers. So again, it's really a collaborative, reciprocal relationship that's built under this practice-based coaching framework. So the skills that are targeted, again, I alluded to within the context of shared book reading. So that's the vehicle under which we're going to be delivering these particular strategies. So we're obviously targeting, in this study, we're targeting child level behaviors as well as teacher level behaviors. We, of course, hope that the teacher level behaviors have an impact on those child level behaviors. So in this study, I focused on a child with language delays, specifically looking at vocabulary, which is an important component of oral language, and we know is something that preschool children, they're able to develop those vocabulary skills and have those skills strongly developed before they enter into kindergarten. It helps their success, hopefully helps them become more successful readers and, maybe remediate some problems that could potentially come down the road. So within vocabulary, we have sort of this way of looking at how knowledge is developed. It's the idea of sort of breadth of knowledge versus depth of knowledge. So breadth of knowledge, meaning lots of words are learned. So introducing children to lots of novel vocabulary that's appropriate for their age. And then depth of knowledge, meaning focusing on fewer words so that you can really get into the intricacies of those particular words and really going deeper in terms of their knowledge. So we looked at both expressive knowledge in terms looking at depth and then receptive understanding of target words as well. When we look at the educators, again, focusing on a smaller set of words so we can really get at that depth of knowledge. We know that kids with language delays, preschoolers, need these multiple opportunities to be able to learn vocabulary and really master, what these words are, how you use them in context, definitions, contextualized and decontextualized examples related to these words. So multiple exposures within storybook reading sessions. And so the 3 bolded and underlined behaviors that you see here or skills are, those of you that are in the dialogic reading world, these are probably fairly familiar to you. So they're sort of borrowed from those that sort of peer this knowledge of questioning children, evaluating their response, expanding on their response, and then asking them to repeat, right? So we, in this particular study, we have a few different question prompts, labeling the target word, defining the target word, and then thinking about inferencing, which is a more cognitively challenging skill for preschoolers. And so labeling, sort of getting at more concrete knowledge of that particular word, and then inferencing, getting at, a little bit more cognitively challenging aspects of that word because they have to sort of pull in background knowledge and relate it to something that they know. Expansions are adding 1 or 2 words to the child's utterance, which in language, when we're developing children's language, it's so important for us to hear what kids are saying and then be able to provide additional language input to continue to grow that language for them. And then repeating, have the child repeat the utterances that is being provided to them in that expansion. So those are the 3 behaviors that you're going to see as we move through these slides. The other component to this is also fidelity. So we want teachers, educators to be able to implement these strategies with fidelity. One way that the literature suggests that you can influence fidelity is by embedding scripted prompts and responses both. And so Van Cleek and others have done some research in this area that suggests that when teachers are in the midst of shared book reading in a, typically delivered in a whole group setting, it can be very challenging in the moment to come up with question prompts. If you haven't done, if you haven't set these up for yourself beforehand, it can be difficult in the moment to not only ask questions, but to also then think about, how am I going to evaluate that child's response? How am I going to expand on what they say? I got to get them to repeat it, and I'm managing, everything else that's going on. So for that reason, we also wanted to ensure fidelity by providing these embedded prompts and responses, which I'll show you a little bit more here in just a second. So research questions for this study, there were two. So what are the effects of practice-based coaching with scripted supports on a paraprofessional's implementation of shared book reading strategies? And then sort of a secondary outcome, if her implementation of those strategies with fidelity has an influence or improves vocabulary knowledge for a preschool child with a language delay. So it's a paraeducator child dyad, and I'll talk more about them in just a second. So participants, we had a paraeducator named Tasha, and she had been teaching in the current classroom for 13 years. So again, lots of experience in that same classroom. It was an early childhood special education classroom, so every child in that room had an IEP. We were able to consent one child, and the criteria was preschool age, English speaking. We went in and we wanted kids to have a current IEP with a documented delay in language skills or a language goal on their IEP. So that was sort of the criteria for us getting the child participant. We wanted someone who we thought would benefit from this study. Settings, the book reading sessions themselves took place in a quiet area of the classroom or adjacent room. If I remember correctly, Erin was not a napper. So I think Tasha did a lot of her book readings during the time when the other kids in the classroom were napping or otherwise engaged in sort of in activities that were quieter activities. And then Tasha and the coach met with in an adjoining classroom in a mutually agreed upon time. If I remember correctly, again, I believe it often happened after school. So they sat down and they met for about 30 or 45 minutes once a week to do those coaching sessions. Materials and vocabulary targets. So there were a number of materials. Some of these have been iterations from previous studies that were all actually developed initially from materials that I was able to borrow from colleagues who have done coaching studies as well. So I have examples to show the performance feedback sheet, which is a graph and a summary of the actual data that we took on Tasha's behaviors, as well as that action plan form that's part of the PBC framework that has goals and associated actions. The materials were all age and developmentally appropriate storybooks for preschoolers. If anyone's interested in this list, let me know. I actually have a couple of lists going because I've done iterations of this study a number of times, and there's lots of great children's storybooks out there for preschoolers. So let me know if you're interested. I can provide you that list. The scripted resources, or the scripted supports rather, that were specific to each storybook, we called a resource handout. Those are what we gave to the coach and were provided to Tasha, that had the scripts of the questions and the expansions and the repeat. Those we wrote ourselves. Again, some of them came forward from a previous study. Others were brand new that myself and the doctoral students that worked with me on this project were able to put together. And they were a great help in contributing to that piece of it. We used an iPad so that we could measure receptive vocabulary, which I can show you, talk about more here in next couple of slides. And then we had vocabulary probes that, again, we've developed over iterations of the study to look at expressive and receptive understanding of the target words. And for Erin, we did pre and post tests. So pre-test the day before a book was read, and then post-test the day after she read for 3 days. So pre-test before day 1, and then post-test after day 3 of reading the same book. The vocabulary targets, we kind of followed Beck and McCowan's approach in terms of tier 2, thinking about high utility words that they're likely to encounter in future conversations or readings. We also wanted the targets to relate to the context of a story in a significant way. And I also Kelly and Goldstein have published a number of articles on vocabulary, and they talk about the importance of having a child-friendly definition that you can provide, that the words are illustrated somehow in the storybook, and that you can connect the words to a number of contexts that are familiar to children. So those are the criteria that we use to select our vocabulary targets for each storybook. A single case design was employed for this. We did a multiple baseline across behaviors. I actually did a study the year before this where we taught all 3 behaviors at the same time. And it turned out to be very challenging for teachers to be able to do that. And so I kind of thought, well, let's see if we teach 1 behavior at a time, if that makes it a little bit more manageable. So that's why we did across behaviors. In this particular design, the behaviors themselves are non-reversible. They're functionally similar but independent. The way that these behaviors, they're actually sort of hierarchical, and that you would expect that teachers would have to know how to ask appropriate questions and evaluate a child's response before you then could expand on that response and then ask them to repeat that expansion. So that was sort of the rationale for how we established those behaviors in the tiers. There's a baseline and intervention phase, and again, shared book reading 3 times a week with the same book, and all of the books. I think we use 6 books in total across the intervention, so 6 weeks of intervention, and we had 3 target words that we selected from the books. Okay. Measures, we video recorded everything. So we video recorded Tasha reading. She video recorded herself reading the sessions. We did it old school with SD cards and all of that. Luckily, I've been able to discover software that this study I'll talk about at the end has allowed us to be able to do something virtually, which is really cool. But we did do it old school with actual SD cards and swapping back and forth. It was quite a process. But Tasha, her teacher, her strategies, the behaviors were basically coded as percentage of correct opportunities out of 9. So we had 3 target words times per book times 3 question types, given that opportunities to expand, which is the second behavior, and repeat. Behavior 3 were contingent upon that first behavior, which was the question and evaluate. And then we used, in single case design, we use visual analysis to determine immediacy of effect and trend, variability of the graph data. And I'll show you that figure here in just a second. And then for Erin, we measured her changes in depth of knowledge on that expressive and receptive probe that we administer, scores from pre to post. And I have, there's a rubric that we developed, again, over the course of several studies that we use to sort of measure depth of knowledge and what that looked like for definitional questions and for inference questions. Labeling questions are pretty straightforward. Either they can label the target word or not, but we wanted to teach. I found over the years that preschool children have different ways, especially kids with language aids. We want them to have as many opportunities to respond as possible. And so this rubric has sort of changed over the course of the years as we learn, as I've learned more about how we can help kids, because the knowledge is in there. It's just how are they going to demonstrate it? What does that look like for them? And it's not always verbal. Sometimes it's a model or a gesture that they're able to provide, especially for verbs, for example, which the words that we selected, we tried to get a fair amount or kind of balance between concepts and verbs so that kids could have exposure to both types. So here is the expressive, or the data form that we use to collect the child level data. So here are the 3 target words. For this particular book, the words were hide, peek, and hair. And you can see that the questions are specific to definition. So asking what the word means, and then trying to sort of get at that inferential component. So where could you hide? And again, I'd be happy, I don't think I included the rubric here for how we, on a scale of 0 to 3, how we were able to measure the types of responses. And you can imagine we get all kinds of interesting things from 4-year-olds. So that's always fun. But we had Tasha herself wrote down the responses. So we gave her these forms. She wrote down the responses that Erin gave. And then, as I mentioned, we had an iPad that had a menu of 4 pictures for each of the target words, 3 distractors, and 1 that was the target word. And so what you see here is she would show the iPad that had the 4 pictures on it, ask Erin, show me hide. And so obviously we would put the number on here that corresponded with the correct picture so that she knew which picture was actually the correct picture of hide. We use Google Images. So that's what the child level behavior data collection looked like. Procedures. So during baseline, we asked Tasha just to read as she normally would. We gave her no direction, no scripts, no coaching. When we entered intervention, then we did a training session on each strategy. So the training session happened before each behavior was taught. So she was only trained on each behavior. She was trained on them one at a time. So first on question evaluate, then on expansion, then on repeat. So in the coaching session, when we introduced the behavior, there would be a 15-minute PowerPoint presentation. The coach would deliver that. There were scripted procedures where we talked about the strategy, described what it was, and gave multiple opportunities for her to practice with the coach. And then we asked her to implement the scripted prompts that were on that resource sheet. So during each storybook reading session, she had that resource sheet available to her and she could follow along, implement those scripted prompts. The coach helped her to work through those and talk about how to use that script in the way that was most meaningful to her. And then the weekly coaching sessions were again 30 to 45 minutes following that framework that we talked about earlier. She was provided performance feedback, the action plan, there was guided practice and modeling using that resource sheet that had all the scripts on them, talking about what sort of support she needed, and then a timeline for meeting that goal, which was generally a week. We did weekly coaching sessions. So some goals, it took a little, it may have been a couple of weeks that it took for her to meet that goal. But again, it was all individualized and based on Tasha's needs and what was happening when she was delivering the intervention. And the child level data, again, was collected, I think I already said this earlier, but collected by Tasha before the book was read each day, before that book was read on day 1, and then following the last reading on day 3. And the pre and the post test were exactly the same. I should mention, and I don't think I actually put this on my slides, we pre-tested Erin on all of the words from all of the books. So we typically selected 5 or 6 that were possibilities, but then we screened those ahead of time to make sure she didn't already have knowledge on those words and we weren't teaching her words that of course she already knew or had knowledge about expressively. So we did a pre-test where we sort of asked her, what do you know about this word? Tell me everything you can about this word. And if it seemed like she had expressive knowledge based on our rubric, then we would throw that word out and we wouldn't use it as a targeted word for teaching, for instruction. So this is the performance feedback sheet that the coach shared with Tasha. It's an example, it's not an actual performance feedback sheet from the study, but the week would be indicated, the goal would be indicated. So the coach would transfer the goal from the action plan onto this form and talk about it. So that would be there and they could review it. She would actually show the line graph of the data. So here's where you were in baseline, here's where you are in intervention. So A represents baseline, B represents intervention. The coach would summarize the graph data, put anecdotal notes in there, and then they would talk about, she and Tasha would talk about the evaluation of the goal based on the data and said, how do you think you did? Did you meet your goal? What's going on? And they would have a conversation. This was also the time when the coach, because she reviewed the sessions prior to, the book reading sessions prior to coming to coach, could highlight clips and bring those to show her so that she could see where she had implemented the strategy and what that looked like. And then also missed opportunities or other, and they could talk about other things that Tasha felt like were important to discuss, both things that were working and things that might be barriers. We also tried to share Erin's pre and post test data, I believe, along the way so that she could see that what was happening in the book reading sessions was actually having an impact on Erin's vocabulary as a way to be like, yes, this is working. What you're doing is making a difference. We can see that she's having some growth and knowledge around these words, which I think was helpful to her. I think she kind of sensed it and could see the changes that happen sort of incrementally, but I think that was an important piece as well. This is an example of an action plan. So this includes the goal, those supports that we talked about in terms of what Tasha would need. And then Tasha herself filled out these action plans with the coach's support. So what does she need to do to meet her goal? And she would put those on there. You can see that even the scripted responses were not enough. So having sticky notes on the pages where the questions were to be asked also provided additional support for her. And then what would the coach do? So weekly meeting to review like what sorts of cues within your routine would you need? And they talked about the sticky, that's where the sticky notes came into play. The weekly meeting to review so they could talk about it and providing email feedback. I think some of the coaches, there may have been text exchange, just like checking in, seeing how things are going. Don't forget, make sure you have your question prompts available. You've reviewed them. You have your sticky notes where you want them to be. And then we also added a piece where we could provide individualization opportunities for the student. And so sometimes it was necessary that even after we evaluated the responses, either correct or incorrect, that would work for some kids, but there may be opportunities where a binary choice would be necessary. So they would evaluate the response by saying, is it called a toad or a horse? Because that's what that child needed in order to provide a response. So we were able to not only individualize what we did sort of with the coach, or excuse me, with the educator, but also help her to support the needs of the specific of the child that she was working with. So we did try and make some of those accommodations as well. This is a sample resource sheet or script, the resource sheet that has all the scripts on it. So this is for the book, if you're familiar, Little Blue Truck. There's lots of variations by Alice Schertle. They're really cute books, but this is, I think, the first one that came out. So these are 2 words that were scripted out, so you can kind of see the question and evaluate prompts that were provided for the label prompt, the definition prompt, the inference prompt, the expansions, and then what the repeat prompt would look like. So Tasha would have this in front of her and she would refer to it while she was reading with Erin so that she could make sure she hit all of the different question prompts. And if that was in behavior 1, and then when we added on the expansion, she would have to ask the question and evaluate and then expand on Erin's response. And then finally, when we got through all 3 behaviors that she was taught, she was able then to do question, evaluate, expand, and repeat, all 3 of them at the same time. So okay, we did collect coaching Fidelity as well. So this is our Fidelity checklist that we use, and I apologize, I tried to get it to fit on the screen as best I could, and I'm happy to share this resource with anyone who would like to have it. But this is how we evaluated the coaches' sessions and the types of things that they did to support Tasha. And so what's nice about this, again, is a colleague gave this to me that they used in another coaching study, and I was able to modify it to fit the needs of this particular study. So it was very useful in that way that it can be changed based on the types of instructional strategies that you're teaching, and just other things that you want to see happen within that coaching session. Collaboration was obviously a big piece. So we wanted to make sure that there is a collaborative, component to what's happening in the coaching session. So this is what I think I coded the coaching videos for this particular study. So these are the types of things that I looked for. So this is my second opportunity for comic relief. So I have a number of memes here because, like so many of us, we were full speed ahead with data collection, and then COVID. And so I'm just going to preface before I show my results that, like so many of us, that just everything came to a screeching halt. It is what it is. And so while I was poised to continue with Tasha, and I was going to add on 3 or 4 more participant dyads, obviously we all know how that ended. And so again, this was just sort of my way of not dwelling, but just remembering that I have something. So I'm thankful for that. But my goodness, was it just challenging, I think, for all of us that experienced that and continue to, I think, to a certain degree. So I still think my dog thinks, like, when are you ever going to leave? Why are you here all the time? So here is the data, which for single case folks, you're going to look at this and see that I really What happened there on the repeat is when I had to stop. I think it was right before spring break, so I don't quite have my functional relationship because I wasn't able to get that third behavior. I'd love to have seen replication, across all three, but didn't quite get it. But that said, the data looks quite lovely in general. Once she learned the behavior, she got it. And she was able to maintain across the strategies at 100% criterion. What happened here, we somehow neglected to put the scripts into the resource sheet for this particular book. And so she just didn't ask those questions. So that's why you see that there's some of those are missing. Same thing with expansion. So I think that was a snafu on our end. Otherwise, I believe she would have been at 100% for all three behaviors, or at least the question and evaluate in the expansion behavior. So, but otherwise the data looks quite lovely. I just wish we could have continued and gotten a few more data points for that repeat strategy, maybe collected some maintenance data, but we'll never know. So that's sort of how that looks. In terms of Erin's data, we saw some nice changes from pre to post test. So on her expressive knowledge, her definitional knowledge of the target vocabulary words was fairly low at 4%, so it increased to an average of 42. Her inference knowledge was nothing, 0% at pre-test, it increased to 55 at post-test, so that was pretty nice to see as well. And this is across all 6 weeks of intervention is how we looked at this. And then receptive knowledge, she had, and it's not surprising that she had higher receptive knowledge of some of these target vocabulary words at pre-test, about 55% on average, but her post-test increased to 94, which is nice. So she was able to receptively identify some of the target vocabulary words much more frequently, more successfully rather at post-test. So these results I was happy with. So any of us that study vocabulary, it's a bugaboo trying to get good child level measures and figure out how to accurately capture that knowledge. So I was happy to see these results. So what now? So I've been talking for quite a while. I think we're on time here. So it's under review, so stay tuned. I really hope, shout out to reviewers 1, 2, and 3 out there. If you can go ahead and, move us along, that would be awesome. So hopefully this gets published and we can get it out there. But this also luckily was able to generate another iteration of this project. So currently I'm working with Dr. Kelly Farquharson over in Communication Science Disorders here at FSU. We're doing all of this virtually. We have a shared interest in language development for preschoolers. And so as I was talking to her about paraeducators and how they are underutilized, she's like, you know what, we have SLPAs, which are speech language pathology assistants. And the way she's described it to me is their qualifications and all of that are different state to state. They could have a high school diploma and be directly serving kids. They could have a bachelor's degree. Some of them are supervised by an SLP. Some of them are not, but they're just another population that is underserved in terms of professional development opportunities. So we currently have 3 paraeducators and 3 SLPAs in the Eastern United States. We kind of did a social media blast and we're able to get 6 participants funded through the CRC multidisciplinary grant. And we enter baseline next week. So very excited about the possibilities there. Of course, we had to shifting everything virtually. We had to figure out, how to, all the paper forms, no more swapping of SD cards. We're using Mosaic, which is, I'm still learning, but I'm getting the handle, becoming more proficient on using Mosaic as a way to code our videos for them to be able to upload things. The data is available immediately, which is awesome. So there's no more, let me put this SD card in and wait 25 minutes, depending on my internet speed and all of these sorts of things. So I'm very excited about what's happening with this particular project. So maybe next time I present at Colloquium, I'll have some more, some actual data to talk through related to that. Okay, so I'll stop there before I get to my last question here and see if there's any questions or anything I can clarify for folks, just based on this, what we've talked about so far.
Yeah, so I am looking over the comments here. We have a comment from Taryn, and I agree, Taryn, it was very nice data. It was pretty data. That graph made me smile, and it is unfortunate that you had to stop.
I know.
I was very struck by, especially the immediacy of the effect, right? Once you started using I mean, they went right from not knowing it to doing it 100% of the time,
Yes.
which is a striking effect to have
Well,
on especially adult
yes.
behaviors, which we know are really hard to change.
Yes. And that's one of the things that, so I will mention this current study is that the scripted supports, I mean, it's kind of a common sense. Well, of course she's going to do it. She has these supports in front of her. So what we're doing with this virtual study, we're just going to remove those supports and just do coaching and see what, because we know that adults are going to acquire behaviors different ways, right? There's different pathways to that. Some of them are going to be like Tasha, take off, no problem. Others may need more supports. And so I'm going to take those scripts away this time around and just do the coaching, the PBC coaching piece, and then add on the scripted supports if it's needed, right? And so in a perfect world, I would have liked to continue with Tasha, fade the coaching, see if she's doing it independently. I mean, that would have been wonderful, but that couldn't happen. So I'm hoping that we're able to do that with this next version, is just to kind of see, because we all know that coaching is a very resource heavy sort of PD, a way to deliver PD. And so can't be there all the time. The idea would be that obviously they become independent in what they're doing. So hopefully.
Well, I think, and related to that, Dr. Cabell had a question. I don't know if she had to take off because she thanked you for your presentation.
Oh, sure.
But
yeah.
we can relay the answer to her.
I'm right here.
But
I'm right here.
Oh, you're
Hi,
here.
Sonia.
Okay.
I can
wanna
ask
ask
it because
Sonia?
I'm not
Okay.
sure if it's completely clear. So my understanding is that, thank you for the great presentation. Yeah,
Sure.
my understanding was that that you regularly showed the educator her graph data, and that was intriguing to me in two ways. One is I wanted you to talk about whether you thought that helped her implementation Fidelity. Also, was she in on then what behaviors you were graphing exactly, and is there I'm not a single case design researcher, so I don't know the answer to this question. Because on the one hand, as a coach, it seems like a very explicit way to like change somebody's behavior, and that's really great. On the other hand, so I think maybe I don't know if I'm fully understanding, but do you understand what I'm asking around the individual showing that the data that you're graphing over time to the participant?
Yeah, she did. We did show it to her during every session. So depending on what behavior, the graphs would look different. So when she was learning question evaluate, that was the only set of data that she saw. And then when we moved to expansions, the second behavior, then she would see her question and evaluate data. Of course, we continued to measure that. And then we measure the expansion behavior as well, and then the repeat. And so she was able to see where she was meeting criterion. If she would have dropped off in that question evaluate strategy, then we would have been able to show her that and go back and recoach and readdress that. She luckily did not. She was able to maintain that behavior, but I don't know that she necessarily put together like, hey, we're measuring and graphing and so much, she just knew that these were the things that she was learning how to do, and she could visually see the progress that she was making and could maintain. And so I think that was valuable for her to be able to see and get that feedback in a graphical way, the level of understanding that she had about it in terms of like meaning. I'm not sure that was, something that was all the way clear to her, but I think she definitely understood what that graph was showing in terms of her progress in implementing these. And I think it had a big impact on her fidelity, to answer that question, because she could see what she was doing, right? And so I think for her, that was motivation to keep going, and we did a social validity interview afterward. She talked about how she appreciated learning the strategy. She thought they were really helpful to her in being able to, work with kids and develop their language. And so I think for her, it was a very helpful intervention. She was happy to have participated in it. So I don't know if that quite gets at your question, but.
Yeah, it does. I think that showing her the graph data on a regular interval during coaching takes advantage of kind of when we track our behaviors, or we're able to see the differences in our behaviors, either through tracking or through knowing that that's being tracked, we then that in and of itself also becomes part of the intervention that changes our behavior.
I think so.
It would be interesting to get your thoughts around whether other coaching models that you've seen, if they implemented that piece of it and actually showed them a tracking of their behavior, whether that would be helpful. That's what I was That's really what I was really thinking about.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think there's a component to, and I know Dr. Fleury works in this area as well, but there's a component to a lot of the coaching models that I'm familiar with that gives some sort of performance feedback, but I imagine it looks different. This is how we chose to do it in our particular study. I know some folks do it through emailing and providing feedback that way, sort of like a templated email, and here's what we're seeing you do, and maybe not so much graphically displaying the data or the information, but telling them these are the things that are happening. So yeah, I think it's a unique piece to the coaching framework myself. So, but I don't know if other folks use different ways to do that.
So if I may, I think we may be able to have some empirical data to answer that question, hopefully
Cool.
by this time next year.
Nice.
So we've been talking with Dr. Dennis about how we can get teachers to actually learn these strategies, because it's been really tough in our work. And so, we're evaluating basically a tiered approach to coaching. Right. So we're going to start off with something that is less obtrusive, right, and less burdensome in terms of our time and teacher time. But for the teachers who aren't responding to our coaching, we're going to intensify our instruction using practice-based coaching. So right now we are just doing kind of traditional initial in-service training, and then doing weekly coaching where they're just getting your basic written and verbal feedback, but we're not showing them their data. But that's going to be the next step, right? So I think we'll be able to have some answers, some data to answer whether or not actually seeing their data what makes a difference in terms of teachers' implementation. So hopefully our assumption is not all teachers will need this much coaching, and we don't want to basically waste our time or their time if it's unnecessary. So
Right.
we just want to provide that intensified coaching for those people who really need it. So hopefully we'll be able to add on to this knowledge base in the next year or so.
Thank you.
Yes. Do you want to answer more questions, or did you want to finish up and then answer?
Well, are they related to this particular, or are they more general? Because I am moving to, I hinted at more of like a, practical implications for this sort of thing, and where I'm hoping that we can have a bigger discussion beyond early childhood. So if
yes,
there's
I think it would be safe to save these last few comments or questions for the end of your talk.
Okay, so the last thing here in these last 10 minutes or so, talking about, and again, as Dr. Fleury alluded to, it's very resource heavy to do coaching. And so we know that not everyone is going to need the level of coaching perhaps that we did in this study. So it's, what is this feasibility of implementation within the classroom and other settings as well, which in conversations with Dr. Forcorson, kind of like a coach, the coach being the teacher in the classroom with the paraeducator, same thing, the SLP being the coach of an SLPA, sort of in that dynamic or in that sort of relationship. And so there's lots of different approaches to this. One I found that was interesting was this multi-level approach that's been proposed by Wood and colleagues, which sort of offers, like Veronica was suggesting, Dr. Fleury was suggesting, getting a more intensified approach to coaching to help alleviate some of those concerns about resources and time and energy that goes into all of this. And so again, I was hoping I don't necessarily have talking points on this, other than I hope other folks can chime in and talk about what this could look like in their field and their discipline. Because, of course, I'm looking at this through a lens of special education, especially with preschool age kids, but I'd love to hear other people's thoughts on this topic as well, if we're out of time for that. Or I can address the other questions that are in the chat, whichever.
Well, we do have a question in the chat here from Angel. She just wanted a clarification question. So did you say whether your participant felt that she can maintain the skills without the script? So even though you weren't able to collect data on her independence, or once you faded out or withdrew the coaching, did she comment in maybe the social validity questionnaire that she feels like she can continue doing this on her own?
I feel like we didn't prompt that specifically. I know I think we asked a general prompt in that, do you see yourself continuing to use the strategies that you've been taught moving forward? And she had a positive response to that. I don't know that we specifically addressed, do you feel like you could do this without the scripted prompts? But if I have any of the doc students in here in the room that remember specifically, that's my recollection anyway.
Other than that, we don't have any questions, but for
Okay.
those in the audience, if you have questions, go ahead and put it in the chat and Dr. Dennis will answer them.
Right. Or if we have any discussion around, the possibilities of practice-based coaching in other, arenas, I'd love to hear other people's thoughts on that as well. Because this is a fairly new, new area for me. So I think there's lots of opportunity for this.
Lindsay, if I can, this is Sherry.
Hi, Sherry.
Very nice talk, by the way.
Thank you.
In Science Ed, we're working on a project, Learning Through Collaborative Design, and it's an instructional model for in-service high school biology teachers to better support students' talk and sense-making in science. We want students to be actively constructing ideas. And Mirai's taught us to, after a summer of professional development, to work with teachers in an ongoing fashion during the academic year. So we watch videotapes of their instructions, and then as a group try to point out places in instruction that we can unpack in terms of their success. Where did they get the class? And we've had to take great care situating those conversations around support and sense making about tools rather than teacher evaluation. Because as soon as we talk about videotapes, and one of these schools is in a district in South Florida that's been heavily evaluated by national groups, that takes a lot of care to have to make sure that those, you would use the language of coaching conversations, is seen as a support tool. So what's your secret sauce for getting teachers to see that sort of support, not in a frightening way or an evaluative way, but as in a supportive way?
Right. I think it's sort of built in from my understanding into the practice-based coaching framework, the way that we talk about it, and that you're establishing a rapport and a relationship, with this person because you have such constant contact with them. And so it's almost like you're in this together. So I think that is a big piece of why it felt not evaluative, but supportive, and not pointing out flaws or deficits, but, here are some things that you're doing really, really well. Let's talk about how we continue to grow other opportunities where you can insert some of those other behaviors. And so for me, I think it comes down very simply to relationship building, and hearing the teacher's concerns and thoughts about what's going on. We had, in a previous study, we actually had a teacher that she's like, your definitions are great. Do you mind if I tweak these a bit, or can I add some of, and we were like, yeah, take this and make it your own. And so I think that really was meaningful for them. And so I don't know if that's a necessarily secret sauce per se, but I think for us, that was a big piece of it, is that it was a relationship. It wasn't seen as evaluative.
Thanks, that's helpful.
Sure.
Any other questions or contributions that anyone would like to make about how this work might be useful in other settings? There are some people who are sharing some citations in the chat related to some
Oh,
of the
gotcha.
previous
Sherry's
comments.
question.
Yep.
Okay,
Mhm.
great. I'll put my email address up here just in case.
So this is your last chance to ask questions. Otherwise, we will wrap it up. So if you have any burning questions for Dr. Dennis, now is the time to ask. Okay, well, you do have Dr. Dennis's contact information there. So if you do think of any questions, you can reach out to her.
Definitely.
But at this point, I would say if the conversation has come to a close, I say let's end a little bit early. Yeah.
And I think we have, is Dr. Myers here? I think is he on our October? Dr. Ibork, remind me, does that sound right? Is he our October speaker? Okay, so in case Dr. Myers, you're still here, FYI, we'll be reaching out to you for November talk. So be on the lookout for more for postings about his talk as well in November. Thank you all for your time. I appreciate it. I hope everyone has a lovely weekend.